Hello everyone, Timothy here with Mana Rocks. Thanks for joining me today to take a look at the Zendikar Ryzen update for our Arena Peasant Cube. As a quick reminder, Peasant Cube includes only commons and uncommons, so we'll be taking a look at all of the lower rarity cards from Zendikar Ryzen that will be making their way into our cube. As always, if you're interested in joining our cube community, I will provide a link to our Discord in the description below this video, and if you have any cards from the set that you feel like we're either over-evaluating or missing out on completely, feel free to leave a comment below. Now, as for Zendikar Ryzen itself, it's worth noting the parasitic nature of the mechanics in the set, and how these sorts of mechanics don't tend to translate well into the context of Cube. There are Landfall payoffs, party mechanics, Kicker Matters payoffs, and specific tribal themes with some of the party types like Clerics and Rogues, none of which are fully supported themes in the Cube, and would require quite a bit of rework and to make optimal use of these mechanics. That being said, there are some interesting additions scattered throughout, and we'll talk about all of the new cards that we've selected to make their way in the cube. We're going to knock this out in Wooborg order, so let's go ahead and get to it. First up on our list is the Attended Healer, a 2/3 for 4 and a white, which reads, whenever you gain life for the first time each turn, create a 1/1 cat token. Additionally, you can pay 2 and a white to give another target cleric lifelink until end of turn. The black-white life gain deck in the cube has seen a moderate amount of success, making good use of cards like Silver Smoke Ghoul and Ajani's Pridemate to turn life gain into onboard advantage. There's certainly no shortage of life gain in the cube, and Attended Healer seems like a promising payoff for dedicating yourself to a life gain deck. It turns incremental life gain into a go-wide game plan, and can even create a self-contained engine with cards like Bushmeat Poacher and Lampad of Death's Vigil, using the cat token as sacrifice fodder, gaining life off the sacrifice ability, and creating another token. It's limited to once per turn, but it still seems worthwhile to try out. We're not putting much stock in the activated ability, as clerics aren't highly represented in the cube, but the card is a cleric itself, which could matter a bit for any party-relevant cards that enter the cube. Fearless Fledgling is up next, 1 and a white for a 1/1 Griffin with a Landfall ability that puts a +1/+1 counter on it and gives it flying until end of turn. We've got a little bit of wiggle room in our 2-drop white section, so we've decided to give the Fledgling a test flight, if you will. While it makes for a pretty weak top deck for an aggressive white deck later in the game, that's true of most 2-drop white creatures, and the Fledgling packs a serious punch when played on turn 2. It has explosive potential when played on curve, attacking with evasion as early as turn 3. The Fledgling keeps its counters with each landfall trigger, so it will become a more and more imposing threat for the opponent as the game goes on, and often attacks in the air. There's a good chance that in the late game, even if you miss a land drop, the Fledgling can still turn sideways even without flying. This is all without mentioning that Fledgling can pick up counter synergies with cards like Conclave Mentor for an even more explosive start. There's a sneaking suspicion in the community that it may prove to be one of the better aggressive white creatures in the cube. Next up is Kite Sail Cleric, a 1/1 flyer for a single white mana with Kicker, 2 and a white, that says when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, tap up to 2 target creatures. The immediate comparison for this card is Ardenvale Tactician, which has been a reasonably good card in aggressive white decks, and is, in my opinion, clearly better than the Kite Sail Cleric. The Cleric is not a substantially powerful card, but more of a test card to fill the spot of another card that hasn't been performing. Leonin Vanguard has been a fairly weak card for basically every deck, and so we feel like a 1-mana 1/1 flyer with some upside might be a fine card to try out in its spot. On top of this, we're looking to push the blue-white flyers archetype a little more, and giving them access to another cheap flyer in white seems like a welcome addition. Again, we're not saying that Kite Sail Cleric is a game changer by any means, just that we think it might have some reasonable utility for a couple different decks. Kicking off blue for us, we have Jawari Disruption, which is being considered here as a means to make our suite of counter magic in the cube a little less catch-all and a little more variable and situational. It's 1 in a blue for an instant that counters target spell unless its controller pays 1 mana. It can also be played as Jawari Ruins on the back, which is just a tapped blue source. This card is a great example of how versatile these modal spell/land cards can be. The front half of this card is not exceptional. In fact, if that's all this card was, we wouldn't even be talking about it. After all, we already have Censor in the cube, which would just be strictly better, but the Force Spike ability is situationally powerful. It drops off in the late game, but it interacts well in the early turns of the game, often countering your opponent's 2-drop or 3-drop, and occasionally snagging a 4 or 5-drop later in the game. The back half saves it when the card would otherwise be a dead draw, and while admittedly a tapped land in the late game isn't exceptional either, having access to this card in your deck lets you play a 16 land deck without sacrificing the consistency of your mana base and simultaneously increasing your spell density. We'll actually be bringing this up quite a bit with some later cards. Don't underestimate the ability to cheat on land count in your limited deck. As a side note for Jawari Disruption, it's mostly being considered as a replacement for Exclude, which has proven to be a complete blowout against green decks, and since green decks are in a difficult spot at the moment, we figured we could tone down a counterspell and try out something new in its spot. Also, with both Jawari Disruption and Censor in the cube, it might be time to start playing around this sort of effect if you're up against a blue deck. Merfolk Falconer is up next. 3 blue for a 4/4 flyer that says whenever you kick a spell, scry 2. Now, we don't actually care very much about the kicker text. It could come up on rare occasion with something like Blink of an Eye, but it's not why we're interested in the card. The reason we're playing this card is because at face value, it's an air elemental with a more relevant type line. We recently replaced actual air elemental with Ominous Sphinx, not because the extra text on the Sphinx really mattered, but because it was technically a strictly better card, and the text could matter. It wasn't a significant change, and we don't anticipate that the change from Ominous Sphinx to Merfolk Falconer will be much different, but adding a wizard to the cube for virtually no cost in card quality seems worthwhile. Every wizard gives a tiny bump to the party mechanic, which isn't featured prominently, but we've also got cards like Wizard's Lightning floating around that have minor wizard text on them. Again, not a huge change, just a minor upgrade to creature types for some corner case scenarios. Let's go ahead and take a look at Solundi Vision next, which will be a replacement for Radical Idea. Solundi Vision is 2 and a blue for an instant that lets you look at the top 6 cards of your library and pick an instant or sorcery from among them to put into your hand. Just like Jawari Disruption, it can alternatively be played as a tapped blue source from the hand. Now, Radical Idea is not a bad card, quite the opposite actually, but we want to try some of these new modal land cards out since they're such a new concept to us. What we like about Solundi Vision is that the front half of this card is quite relevant in the late game. If you draw this on turn 6, it has a pretty significant effect of finding another spell while still triggering all of your spell matters cards. In other words, similar to how Radical Idea is functionally 2 spells built in one, Solundi Vision is a spell that finds another spell, with a great deal of selection attached, and asks very little of you due to the safety net of being a tap land when necessary. We wouldn't be surprised if some of these modal lands don't quite get there, but we're going to try out the ones that stand out to us. Let us know what you think of these cards. They have been pretty tough ones to evaluate. Next up is Wind Rider Wizard, a Windrake variant, or 2/2 flyer for 2 and a blue, that reads, whenever you cast an instant, sorcery, or wizard spell, you may draw a card, then discard a card. So we're looking at a reasonably costed flyer with an occasional loot attached to casting spells, or even wizards in some instances. We've recently added Reckless Scholar to the mix, and while Reckless Scholar isn't a particularly exciting looter, it has shown how effective having a quote-unquote free loot each turn can be, especially when you don't have to dip into another color for something like Obsessive Stitcher. Wind Rider Wizard is a little more finicky. You won't necessarily get to loot every single turn, or even when you really want to, given cards like counters and other instant speed interaction, but on the flip side, you might occasionally get to loot multiple times in the same turn. While there are some pros in favor of a generic looter like Reckless Scholar, the big upside to Wind Rider Wizard is that it engages in combat better, trading for all the same creatures that Reckless Scholar would, plus flyers, all while being an evasive threat. Scholar can block, but it can't attack and loot, which is what hurts it the most, whereas the wizard attacks in the air and loots, albeit not very reliably. There's some debate around how many looter effects we want centered in blue, and while Wind Rider Wizard doesn't exactly answer that question, it is a welcome addition to the cube. Our first black card is Acquisitions Expert, a 1/2 human rogue for 1 and a black. When it enters the battlefield, your opponent reveals a number of cards in their hand equal to the number of creatures in your party, and you choose 1 to discard. Remember that this counts itself as a rogue, so even with no other party support, this will grab your opponent's worst card from their hand and ship it to the graveyard. That alone makes it a strict upgrade to Burglar Rat, which has been a solid playable for most black decks. Technically, the expert can be killed in response to its trigger, so it's not a full-on strict upgrade to Burglar Rat, but close enough. If your opponent ever only shows you 1 card with the Acquisition Expert's effect, that's the equivalent of getting the card that Burglar Rat would have made them discard anyway. And the expert gets a decent amount better if you happen to have other party members laying around. Party isn't being intentionally pushed for cards like this, but it's a nice bonus when it happens. The 1/2 body and the option to occasionally get some selection out of the discard makes this an easy swap for Burglar Rat. The next entry to our cube from the black section of Zendikar Rising is Bloodchief's Thirst. Before we discuss this card, it's hard to talk about it without also mentioning Feed the Swarm, which is another premium removal spell from the set. Now, if you've been with us for any reasonable amount of time, it's no secret that black is easily the best color in the cube, and even with numerous nerfs to black's removal suite and a few soft bans on cards like Phyrexian Reclamation, black still outperforms the other colors. With that being said, we have to be careful about introducing too many cheap, unconditional removal spells into black from new sets. This is all to say that despite having 2 new kill spells in black, both of which are quite powerful, we've opted to only include 1, in this case being Bloodchief's Thirst. The card is still quite good. For a single black mana, it takes down any creature or planeswalker with CMC 2 or less at sorcery speed, and if you kick it for an additional 2 and a black, it removes the CMC restriction and becomes 2 black, destroy target creature or planeswalker. We like the versatility of being a cheap answer to early game creatures while being a reasonably costed but not overpowered kill spell for the mid to late game. Its versatility is tempered a decent amount by being a sorcery, but again, we've got to keep an eye on black's removal, so we're going to give Bloodchief's Thirst a trial run and see if it's a good fit for the cube. Because black doesn't already have enough good cards, we now have access to Marauding Blight Priest, a more accessible version of Epicure of Blood. It's a 3/2 for 2 and a black that says whenever you gain life, each opponent loses a life. We've already talked about how much life gain there is scattered throughout the cube and how white-black functions primarily as a life gain control deck. The Blight Priest adds another piece to this puzzle and gives you a legitimate way to turn life gain into an actual win condition, all without paying too much of a cost since a 3-mana 3/2 is a perfectly reasonable body to put on board. Bonus points for picking up the Cleric creature type, which will have some minor relevance here, and we've got us a rock-solid addition to the cube. Our next card is an interesting one and is again another example of us using a flex slot to test out a new card, in this case Black Bloom Rogue. It's 2 and a black for a 2/3 with Menace that gets an additional +3/+0 if your opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. It's also a modal land and can be played as a tapped black source on the back. Now, here's the thing. We're not going out of our way at this moment to support the rogue theme as advertised in Zendikar Rising Limited, which focuses on milling the opponent and hitting a threshold of 8 or more cards in the opponent's graveyard. But we've noticed that many games do in fact become extended exchanges of resources within the context of the cube, and it's not uncommon to get into a grindy matchup where your opponent just naturally hits 8+ cards in their yard. The Black Bloom Rogue starts off as a passively statted creature and becomes quite the beater once you hit that magic number of 8 or more. This leads us to believe that, coupled with the option to play it as a land from the hand, Black Bloom Rogue might prove to be a generically good card for a number of different black decks, even though it's not being slotted in for any specific archetype. Thwart the Grave is our next card, and it's one that I'm personally advocating for testing out, even though I admit it might not make the cut in the long run. It's a whopping 6 mana, 4 black, for a sorcery that returns target creature plus another target party creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. It also costs 1 less for each party member you control, so it shouldn't be too rare that you get a Cleric or Wizard on board and manage to cast this for 5 mana, which is kind of the going rate for reanimation spells at the peasant level. Obviously, there are some absolutely sick scenarios with Thwart the Graves where you can reanimate 2 creatures at once and blow your opponent out of the water, but there will certainly be times where this only hits 1 creature. I like the mini game you have to play while drafting this card where you have to actively seek out some party creatures, and I'm usually a big fan of cards that can change your pick priorities, so I'm curious to see how Thwart plays out and what combinations of creatures people are bringing back with it. Perhaps it's not supported enough and doesn't make the cut, but we're going to try it out for now. Quite literally kicking things off for us in red, we have Cinder Clasm, an instant for 1 in a red that deals 1 damage to each creature, or, if kicked for an additional red mana, deals 2 damage to each creature. I've gone on record before for saying how effective sweepers are in the context of a peasant setting, where we don't have access to full-on board wipes, and having a modal version of a sweeper seems pretty good. Flame Sweep has been an almost irreplaceable card for red control decks to deal with go-wide strategies, and we even recently added Flames of the Firebrand to provide a similar effect. Cinder Clasm is slightly less splashable since the full effect costs 1 red, but being able to wipe out an army of 1/1 tokens for 2 mana, or sweep all of the 2 toughness creatures away for an additional mana seems powerful. Red sweepers don't normally get much better than this, so if you plan on playing an aggro deck in the upcoming weeks, be wary of this inclusion. Our red 3-drop section is stacked with powerful cards, so it's difficult at this point to make a 1-for-1 swap with a new 3-drop red creature, but Skyclave Geopede has us interested enough that we're finding room for it with this update. Aggressive landfall creatures are a bit tricky since we're not fully invested in making landfall a supported archetype, but the Geopede hits so hard when you do hit land drops that we're speculating it'll be a good fit for the Gruul beatdown decks. For the record, Geopede is 2 in a red for a 3/1 trample that gets +2/+2 with its landfall triggers. That's a 5/3 trample or attacking if you're regularly hitting land drops, which is quite the beater. The Gruul decks have been missing good high power beaters at the 2 and 3 mana slots, and Geopede feels like it might be a good role player for us. Next up is our only red modal card on the list, Spikefield Hazard. It's pretty straightforward. For 1 red mana at instant speed, it deals 1 damage to any target, and if a creature dealt damage this way would die this turn, it exiles that creature. It can also be played as a tapped red source on the back half. So there's a couple things to mention here. First off, red has struggled a bit with dealing with recursive engines in black, namely cards like Reassembling Skeleton and Silver Smoke Ghoul. Red's Exile Suite is virtually non-existent outside of Lava Coil, so we were discussing introducing a new effect like Magma Spray to the cube before we saw this new addition. While it's true that Magma Spray is obviously a better effect than Spikefield Hazard when cast, the Hazard has a few things going for it. First, it can hit any target, and while 1 damage isn't exactly the be-all end-all of burn damage, red decks can still make good use of it. More importantly, we believe that the option for an all-in red burn deck to replace a mountain with this card is pretty substantial, as it adds an extra point of damage to your deck without sacrificing your land count. Sure, a tap land isn't something that red decks really want, but we think the middle ground of being an answer to recursive threats and a minor burn spell that cheats on land count means we're happy to try it out. Next up is a pretty obvious inclusion. Royal Eruption is 1 in a red for a sorcery that deals 3 damage to any target, or deals 5 damage instead if kicked for 5 additional mana. Yes, that's 7 mana total for the kicked version, but the base card is just solid enough that it's still an excellent piece of removal or burn. Similar to how we're monitoring the addition of unconditional removal spells for black, we've got to be careful not to overload red with too much burn, so it's always a bit unnerving to welcome new burn spells into the environment, but we're swapping out Direct Current for this card, so it seems like the net sum should be about the same either way. Not too much else to say. I think most people will understand that Royal Eruption is about as close to an auto-include as red cards get in the peasant setting. Our next card is Aquam Hellhound, a color-shifted version of an old fan favorite Steplinks. It's a single red mana for a 0/1 that gets +2/+2 with landfall. While I think the Steplinks design is a bit of a product of the past, and this makes for a pretty lousy top deck later in the game, our 1-drop red creatures have some room for improvement, so we're happy to test out new ones when we get them. Will it be an all-star? Probably not. but we do have the trifecta of Evolving Wilds effects that can definitely help it push through a large chunk of damage, so it might not be too bad either. Again, another watchlist addition, but we'll wait and see how it performs. Green won't be getting too much from Zendikar in the way of new and interesting effects, but it does benefit from having some of the most interesting modal lands. The first one we're including is Balagued Recovery, which is 2 and a green for a sorcery that lets you return target card from your graveyard to your hand. This is the type of modal card we like. It's a land in the early game when you just need to hit land drops, and it's a welcome effect to have in the late game to rebuy something you lost early on. It grabs any card too, unlike Pulse of Marasa or Fungal Rebirth. While those cards are both generally better effects than Balagued Recovery, we can't overstate how powerful it is to play an effect like this in place of a basic land. A tap land is not exactly free, but it's close, and when these tap lands provide you with a useful late game effect, we feel like that's something worth looking into. Green-white counters has had an interesting history in our cube. It started off as one of the premier archetypes of the cube, taking down several drafts in a row after the addition of core 2021 cards. Then we pulled back some of the +1/+1 counter cards to balance it out, and now it's settled down to a deck that doesn't get drafted often, but can still have explosive draws when drafted correctly. We're pretty happy to try out Iridescent Horn Beetle as a new addition to this archetype. It's 4 and a green for a 3/4, which is below the bar, but at the beginning of your end step, you create a 1/1 insect for each +1/+1 counter you've put on your creatures that turn. While a 3/4 for 5 is a pretty poor ceiling to start with, it's not hard to see how high the roof on this card can get. Cards like Wildwood Scourge and Ugin's Conjurant are nuts with this card. Renata can set up some pretty interesting curve outs, and there are legit wombo combos with Pledge of Unity and Bostry Solidarity. The highs and lows seem fairly balanced for this card, and we're happy to invite another Horn Beetle into the club. Hell, even those cards work together to some degree. Similar to Balagued Recovery, we're swapping out one of our fight effects with the new Kalani Ambush, another modal land with a moderate front half. It's pretty simple, 2 and a green for an instant speed fight, or it can be played as a tapped green source on the back. It's not an exciting effect, it's not even necessarily better than any of the other fights we already have access to, but it is at least an instant, so it has that going for it, and it has all of the benefits of the modal spells we've talked about up to this point. I've heard grumblings about these cards from people who claim that the effect you get isn't very powerful, and there's some truth to that, but frame it like this. If this was just a normal land in a different set, let's say a tapped green land, that said instead of playing this as a land, you could use it as a 3-mana instant speed fight, wouldn't that be an exciting card? People should learn from mechanics like cycling on Amonkhet Deserts that being able to get extra functionality out of your land slots is a game changer in Limited. Honestly, we could probably include every new modal land in Zendikar Rising, and few would be horrendously bad, but I digress. Kalani Ambush gives us a modal fight / land for green, and if we can do anything to up green's consistency in the cube, we're happy to make that change. Last up for our monocolored cards, we have a pretty simple one, Canopy Bayloth. It's a 4/3 for 3 and a green, and it simply gets +2/+2 with Landfall. Not the most exciting card, but it's a pretty beastly beater for the green decks. We like that you don't necessarily need Landfall every turn for this to do something relevant, but it hits like a truck when you are hitting your lands, which is made even more possible by the inclusion of new modal lands we've been discussing. Green also has access to cards like Migratory Path and Cultivate, which can push the Bayloth into the 8+ power camp, which is nothing to scoff at. It's not flashy, but it's got potential, and we're trying it out. Well, there's not too much to talk about with the multicolored section. To be fair, the gold section is the hardest section of the cube to parse out when it comes to new cards, since the sections are already fairly tight. There is one card we'll be trying out as a recommendation from our admin team, and that's the Gruul Uncommon from Zendikar, Brushfire Elemental. It's red-green for a 1/1 with haste that gets +2/+2 with Landfall, and can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. A line of text that we found to be quite useful on our green creatures to get them past the numerous death touchers in black. Brushfire Elemental has the same drawbacks as most landfall creatures. It's not an exceptional blocker, it loses value in the late game when you're not hitting as many land drops, and it suffers from poor draws where you just don't hit many lands in the first place. That being said, a turn 2 Brushfire Elemental will often go unblocked for the first 3 to 4 turns of the game, potentially even longer against decks short on bigger creatures, and if the Elemental can push in 6, maybe even 9 damage before it drops off, well, that's pretty damn good for your 2-drop. I'm curious how all the aggressive landfall creatures are going to play out, since once again, we're not pushing ourselves to support landfall as a full strategy, but our admin team really likes this card, so we're going to see how it plays out. At the making of this video, we hadn't quite settled on which colorless cards we were considering for the cube, but we did recognize that there's a bit of wiggle room in our artifact section. We might be considering either of the big artifact creatures for a test run. There's Relic Golem, which is a 3-mana 6/6 that can't attack or block unless your opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, but taps to mill target player for 2. It's clearly built as a tie-in for the rogue decks in Zendikar Rising, and the fact that it can't block early on means it's likely not making the cut for us, but it's on the table. The other is Seagate Colossus, a 7-mana 7/5 Golem Warrior that costs 1 less to cast for each creature in your party. Again, nothing exceptional, since ramp decks that are interested in expensive creatures have much better options, and the Colossus doesn't offer any protection or evasion, but it's not unrealistic to see this coming down for 5 or 6 mana in some games. Still not sure that's even really that good, but as with most colorless cards at the peasant level, we work with what we've got. Spare Supplies is another card that interests me, as it's a 2-mana artifact that enters the battlefield tapped and draws a card on entering, then can be tapped and sacrificed for 2 mana to draw another card. It's basically a slow divination in the colorless section for decks that might not have access to card draw, but ultimately this might be too much of a do-nothing card, and it'll eat up a colorless slot and never actually see play. None of our options for colorless cards in Zendikar Rising are outstanding, but like I said, there's some already below the bar cards in the cube's artifact slots, so don't be shocked if you see one of these in the near future. Alright, that wraps up our review of the new additions to our Peasant Cube from Zendikar Rising. With the exception of some possible last-minute changes, you can expect to see all of these cards in our next update. If you've got any favorites or sleepers that you didn't see here, tell us about it in the comments below, or come join our Discord server, which I'll be posting in the links below. As always, you can subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and you can find me on Twitter at MTG_Manarox. I'm looking forward to drafting this new set with you all. My name's Timothy, and I'll see you all next time.